Favorite comfort movies. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now I've done a couple of these videos in recent weeks talking about my favorite comfort media. One was my favorite comfort Doctor Who stories, one was my favorite comfort horror movies. This time around I want to talk about just my favorite movies excluding the horror genre, because there are still a lot of them. Now, as with the horror thing, a lot of them comes down to nostalgia, comfort food from my childhood, which just makes you feel good, as opposed to a lot of modern media that just makes you feel physically ill. Now, rather than start with the 80s, although I suppose it includes the 80s, but I am going to go back to the 70s for some of my comfort movies, and those would be the James Bond movies, specifically the Roger Moore James Bond movies. I make no bones about the fact that I'm not really a big fan of James Bond outside of the Roger Moore movies. I don't mind the Connerys, the Daltons are okay. After that, I can really live without them. But the Roger Moore James Bond movies were a staple of my childhood. I have them all on DVD and Blu-ray. I still love them. I find them very comforting. I associate them with Christmas as well, even though they're not Christmassy at all. But they're, it was a staple of the Christmas TV schedules in the 80s when I was growing up. You'd always have a James Bond movie on, if not Christmas Day, then sometime during the Christmas period, and I still associate that link. Now there were 7 Roger Moore James Bond movies, of course. He is the longest Bond. Yeah, sitting on your ass for 5 years doesn't actually count, Daniel. Sorry. Now, out of the 7, there's only one I'm really not very fond of, and that is Octopussy. I know some people try to defend it. I think it's terrible. I genuinely don't understand why A View to a Kill gets so much hate, because I love A View to a Kill. Whereas Octopussy, it's the one from my childhood that I have no memory of, and I must have seen it, and yet I have no memory of it, and I can completely understand why, because it's really boring. The first 90 minutes seems to be all about counterfeit eggs, and that's about it. Ooh, exciting. Sorry. But this is about comfort movies, not why I hate certain movies. But aside from that, I love the rest of the Roger Moore movies. Some are better than others. I mean, Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, probably my absolute favourite, followed shortly thereafter by A View to a Kill, which is insanely underrated. I really do not get why people do not like A View to a Kill. Christopher Walken, Grace Jones, Patrick Macnee, some great action scenes, great fun. What is wrong with you? The other kind of lesser one I would say is probably Man with a Golden Gun, but that's still pretty good. I mean, it's still Christopher Lee and Nick Nack. I mean, I can easily watch it very easily. So I love the Roger Moore James Bond movies. Now, obviously, as we move into the 80s, a lot of 80s movies are also favourites of mine. Well, I mean, there's still some 70s in there as well, like Spielberg movies, Jaws, Close Encounters. E.T. I'm not sure I would count, even though I have it and I'm exceedingly fond of it. I don't think I've actually seen it for like 20 years. It was the first movie I actually saw at the cinema when I was a very little kid. And I've seen it on TV, and I saw it at the cinema when they re-released it 20 years since. And even though I have the Blu-ray, I have not yet sat down to watch it. Maybe sometime this Christmas I might sit down and watch E.T. But Close Encounters and Jaws are much more regular watches, as is Raiders of the Lost Ark. And now the Indiana Jones movies, the original trilogy, forget anything made in the last 15, 20 years. I like the other two, but I don't think either of them comes close to the original. I think Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of the best movies ever made. Absolutely love Raiders. Doesn't get much better than that. Very iconic, very comfort food. 2 other comfort ones. I suppose I could have put them in horror, because I know some people classify them as horror. I don't really. Is Ghostbusters and Gremlins. Again, 2 of the most iconic movies from my childhood. Absolutely love them. I had Gremlins on like a ex-rental VHS for years as well. I had the novelization with the photos in the middle. I still have it, in fact. I love both those movies tremendously. I don't really regard them as horror. I think Gremlins is probably closer to being a comedy horror. I've never seen Ghostbusters as being in any way horror. It's supernatural, but it's a supernatural comedy. I never found it remotely scary as a kid. Granted, maybe that's because I was watching some serious hardcore shit even as a kid, like the original Elm Street, which well and truly put the shitter at me. So Ghostbusters, I'm sorry, I just never, I never regarded that as being in any way horror or scary. Don't get me wrong, one of my absolute favourite movies of all time. That's why it's on this list. But horror, In a similar vein, I don't think I mentioned this in the comfort food. I don't know if I'd probably put Poltergeist, even though that is horror. But again, it's more to me. It's more family friendly, kind of gateway accessible horror. I love Poltergeist. That again, another of my absolute favorite movies. One of my comfort movies. I adore. I've seen some people said the sequels are better. I think these people were dropped on their head as a child, to be honest with you. Again, I'd put Poltergeist up there with like Raiders. It's one of the most perfect movies ever made, and Ghostbusters and Gremlins. It's just unassailable top 10 for me without any question. Called 80s comedies. I love 80s comedies in general. Well, there hasn't really been much in the way of comedy for a long time from Hollywood, but 80s comedies, I love them in general. I loved the 80s comedy kings, Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, all those guys were my comedy heroes growing up. And even though most of them are still alive, apart from like John Candy, you don't really see them very much. It's not the same anymore, which is sad. But I loved all of those movies. They were staples of my childhood, and they're still comfort movies. If I want a comedy, 9 times out of 10, I'm reaching for an 80s comedy. Even stuff that didn't feature them, like stuff like Better Off Dead, which is, in my opinion, one of the funniest comedies ever made, or Naked Gun. Airplane is another one I very much associate with my childhood. I've also associated it with Christmas. That I'm pretty sure they showed that at Christmas at one time. I can't quite find. I've tried to find the listings for it, but I can't quite figure out when exactly that was shown. But I am sure that was shown over the Christmas period on ITV, because I remember the freaking adverts for it. I remember the freaking adverts for the Christmas thing, including Airplane, like get in crash position. I remember those adverts so clearly from my childhood, and I love Airplane. Again, one of the funniest, one of the best movies of all time in my book. Top 10, top 20, somewhere in there, absolutely unassailable, and very much comfort. So even Airplane 2, which I can see is not as good as the original, but I still find it very much comfort movie, absolutely. As we get into the 90s, it's difficult to think of comfort movies like early 90s. There's still a couple like Steve Martin, like LA Story, and that sort of thing. It's hard to think of more like comfort movies from that decade. I almost forgot to mention Arnie movies. Arnie movies, very much comfort movies as well. Terminator, Commando, Predator. You could kind of call Terminator Predator horror, though debatable. Twins, Kindergarten Cop. Pretty much all Arnie's 80s and even 90s movies, I would say, were comfort movies. Happy Days, better than now. Now, getting into the late 90s, I would say, and probably like the last batch of movies that I would say really fall into the category of comfort movies for me. I mentioned the kind of the horror version of them in the horror video I did. It's like the mid to late 90s, early 2000s kind of teen genre craze that we had. I mentioned the horrors in there that were inspired by Scream, but obviously the kind of the teen renaissance, the horror renaissance might have been inspired by Scream, but it actually started a little bit earlier in terms of like teen movie renaissance with Clueless, which is again one of my favorite comedies, one of my favorite movies. And that led to a whole bunch of like teen comedies like The American Pies and Can't Hardly Wait. Other stuff, not necessarily horror or comedy, like Cruel Intentions or Wild Things. I love that genre. I loved that time. I had a great time with that time. And they're kind of nostalgic in a way, in a different way to the 80s. And yeah, they're kind of comfort food. It's a different kind of comfort food. It's not kind of childhood based, but yeah, it's so long ago now that it is kind of nostalgic, which is kind of terrifying and sad. But there you go. Thinking of any more recent comfort movies, as I said in the horror one, it's difficult. And even one I'm going to mention now is 20 years old, so how recent that is, I don't know. Debs. I love Debs. That's one of my favourite comedies. Really enjoy that. Enjoyed it. Loved it at the time. It stood up for many viewings since. It's still one of my absolute favourite comfort movies. Just a very easy watch. Sexy, funny, sweet, undemanding, just fun and comforting. I enjoy that. It's difficult to think of anything from like, I don't know, the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, I'm not generally impressed with movies in general in the last 5 to 10 years. I suppose one Happiest Season, I did like that. I actually watched that again for the second time. I actually watched it on Christmas Day night last year. I wasn't planning to. I was planning to kind of watch it around Christmas, but for some reason I kind of thought, you know what, I think I'll watch that tonight. Why not? And I've enjoyed it just as much as the first time. Again, as with that, like I mentioned, Ready or Not, in the horror one, it's still a bit too recent for me to really say, yeah, that's a comfort movie. Whereas even something like Debs, I've seen many times over the last 20 years. Whereas that I've only seen like twice. So maybe it will become one. We'll see. We'll see how it stands up. But yeah, that's pretty much my comfort movies. Now, there are some movies I wouldn't put on the list. Don't mean that they aren't my favourites. Again, most of them are kind of horror movies that I mentioned, stuff like Silence of the Lambs and stuff like that, that I wouldn't say is comfort stuff, even though it's one of my favourite movies of all time. But certainly, like most kind of like, if it's action adventure or comedy or something like that, if it stands up and that's comfort stuff. That's something you can just, because this is why I generally favour TV over movies, because I find TV just kind of easier to get into at night. You don't have to concentrate as much. You can just slap on whatever episode of whatever show you're currently watching, and you can just easily settle into it. I think these are the kinds of movies that you can do that with, as opposed to movies that maybe need a bit more effort, and maybe a bit more effort that I'm willing to give in an evening when I'm knackered and had a hard day. Anyway, that's my favourite comfort movies video. I may do another of this series. I may talk about favourite comfort TV shows in general, following on from what I just said. But those are my favourite comfort non-horror movies. Bye for now.